often do. In the previous two sessions, we discussed some of the many reasons why cyber criminals are actually targeting our homes now, of course, in addition to our workplaces. And they're doing this, of course, because we are more vulnerable there. We've got reduced technical security, typically poor cyber hygiene at home. We've got parents and children and grandparents using work devices, et cetera, et cetera. And unfortunately, cyber criminals are using these vulnerabilities in our home environment to get our credentials and then to attack our work environments. Last time, we also discussed the implications of all of this for our organizations, and we talked about what we can do about it. So in these three sessions now, we've had well over 200 people who are interested in the topic because it's important, it's relevant to us all. All right, so look, before we start, a bit of housekeeping. Please, audience, feel free to contribute questions as we go through the Q&A tab at the bottom, and someone on our end will be monitoring those questions as they come in, and we will integrate them into the conversation as appropriate. So now let me introduce myself and our panelists. First, we've got Cheryl Wong, who, after a successful career in the travel industry, she now enjoys educating and empowering people to protect themselves online. She focuses on the human elements of security to manage cybersecurity risks. So that's why she's here with us today, because that's incredibly relevant to the topic at hand. And she influences behavioral change to build a positive cyber culture in the workplace. Sadid Sadid, welcome. Cheryl, welcome. Sadid is a seasoned cybersecurity leader with over 2 decades of experience across the industry. He's held roles at Air Services Australia, Queensland Health. Currently, he's the CISO at Southeast Queensland Water, SEQ Water. And in his words, cyber should not slow you down. It should actually help keep you in business. Ben, lastly, and certainly not least, Ben, welcome, is the director and principal at Ilham Warren Napa. It's a firm of lawyers based in Brisbane. Ben brings to our conversation today, again, over 2 decades of experience managing in the areas of commercial litigation and dispute resolution. Finally, my business partner, Brian Hay. There are few people in Australia or the world who know more about cyber criminals, cyber crime, cyber security than Brian. He was a detective superintendent at the Queensland Police Service for 35 years. Then he went to work for Dimension Data, then Unisys. Then he started cultural cybersecurity with me almost a decade ago. My name is James Carlopio. Apologies for the broad American accent. I've been here since 1990. And I still sound like this. My background is all in psychology and org consulting. So look, let's get into it. Given the lines of cybersecurity have now clearly blurred, if we can mix those words together, between the workplace and our private lives, we're going to discuss the implications of this and, of course, what it means for our organization. So the first question for me, and we'll start with you, Cheryl, if that's okay. What do you say to, do we really now need to be cyber secure 24/7 and from the boardroom to the lounge room? Or is this all a bit too much?
I feel that we definitely need to be secure, well, pretty much 24/7. So if you think about it, what do you do when you finish work? Most people catch public transport, they get on their phones, look at social media, listen to podcasts, check emails, whatnot. If you're working from home, what do you do as soon as you finish work? You jump online again, generally. So I think our world is starting to get blurred. And even organizations, they're pushing us onto the digital platform. Organizations like utility companies don't want to send you physical mail anymore. If they do, they're going to charge you. So they're pushing you onto online platforms to make it easier, faster, efficient. So we actually have to adapt to all these and be, I guess, secure, savvy all day, every day.
Oh, great point. Yeah, my bank keeps bothering me to get bank statements online. And you're right, everybody's pushing to move that way. All right, good. Thank you. Sadid, 24/7, is it overkill?
No, I don't reckon. I think the perimeter has dissolved. Now we're living in a digital space where we do not have actual hard perimeters. work and home are no longer separate domains. If you're looking at it from an attacker's perspective, especially post-COVID, the line has completely blurred. Whether you're home, whether you're, as Cheryl talked about, whether you're in the train, you're basically technically online and you're working. So from an attacker perspective, they can get you anywhere. So cybersecurity from our perspective needs to be continuous and context aware, covering wherever and whenever work is done, regardless whether it's on the mobile, which device you're on, which location you're on, whether you're even in Australia or not. I think we need to take into context our organizational or business understanding and what the context for that business is, and make sure that we are providing appropriate balanced security for our ecosystem.
Fantastic, thank you. Brian, disagree, agree, and then we'll get to you, Ben.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Once upon a time, we had bricks and mortar, and that was where your workplace, and that's where you went, and you worked 8 hours a day, and you may have morning tea, afternoon tea, and your lunch period, and everything was defined, and there was great structure. And now, of course, with the advent of technology, the fast tracking of remote working, here I am at the moment sitting in Bangkok, where I've been working for the last 2 weeks. Everyone thinks it's a holiday. I assure you, folks, it's not. I've been working my tail off. But the landscape and environment is different. And just listening to Sadid and to Cheryl, and we are in an ever-connected world. And I talked about the other day, I talked about the issue of convergence. And I think when I was, in the context of that, I was talking about converging our physical risk and world with our cyber risks and world. But it hit me, of course, we now have convergence between our private and work lives in this digital medium. And I think when you get to something, what makes it's even more blurred when you start to think about, we live in times of chaos. And whilst we've got a history of thinking of containerizing actions, A, B, C plus D, all that sort of stuff, everything's spinning and moving so much. And, to Cheryl's point, people aren't just getting on their social media when they finish work for the day. They're doing it possibly at the table. I remember, and this is going back 15 years, having asked staff in meetings to leave your phones on your desk, please. Otherwise, they would be in the meeting scrolling through social media while we're trying to have a serious conversation about solving crime and all sorts of world problems. So, look, I'm looking forward to how this discussion's going to go, because one of the big slowdowns to solutions that society and politicians come up with is legislation. So I'll be interested to hear what Ben has to say next on this.
Over to you, Ben.
Yeah, oh, well, that was a lot of pressure to legislation. I mean, I could repeat what I think I said last time, that there's been plenty of cases where, not specifically on the cyber front, although one could argue that there's some of those as well, but there's plenty of cases where courts have said that the responsibility of employers and the board doesn't stop at the work premises. If a worker is doing work from home, then that is a workplace. And, again, in the injury context, there's been people who, and I'll just recap very briefly what I said last time, there have been people who have been working in their own home. Their employer didn't know that they had bought a new puppy. They had set up a dog gate for the puppy so that the dog wasn't, pestering them while they were supposed to be working, and then tripped over their own dog gate. And that was a injury sustained in the workplace for which the responsibility lay with the employer. It's when I think, words like blurred and convergence have been used appropriately there. If we were talking about that original Mission Impossible movie with the guy who comes to work inside a secure data room and,
Right.
puts his eye scan and his thumbprint and his key card in, and then he does his work inside that room that Tom Cruise had to sort of lower from the air conditioning vent and hover on in order to, steal the data list. If that was your work environment, well, then you don't need to worry about cyber at home because there's no access at home. But as soon as you've got access, then you've got a concern.
Great. So it seems pretty, and I think it's important to just lay that out, make sure everybody really is on the same page and understands that the workplace is the home place is the workplace. It seems as though the responsibility for this clearly is now on the organization. New legislation's made the board more responsible for many things. So the next question is, it's not who's responsible for this, but we're going to expand it a bit more. My children, my grandchildren, my parents, my partners, we're doing cyber training in many of our organizations for our staff. Is the organization now responsible also to do family members, cybersecurity training, children, teens, tweens, parents, grandparents, or is that a bridge too far? Brian, let me kick off with you on this one, if you would.
Yeah, look, I think it's something to be considered, and let's come back to the fundamentals of a business has a responsibility to manage risk, and the nuances of each organization will determine where that risks sit. But let me put it to this way. It begs the question, and I'd be interested if I could ask Ben's thought on this based on what he said so far. If the children of an employee at home after hours are being targeted by the criminals in order to get to the employee themselves, in order then to get into the network of the target organization, that is the ultimate game. Does that make that an organizational risk, Ben?
Short answer, yes.
There we go. And therefore, and if an organization has the responsibility to manage risk, and we know the Australian High Court decision that said when it comes to cybersecurity, directors have two fundamental responsibilities. One, manage their organizational risk, and two, build organizational or cybersecurity resilience. So then I would argue, James, the answer is organizations need to start thinking about how they protect their families. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean everything that you do for your employee has to be transposed, transferred, and enacted and replicated on the family. But I think we live, as I said, we live in times of chaos, so we need to come up with a chaotic solution to suit these things. But what I applaud is the fact we're talking about it. We're not trying to lay down a blanket cover, but I think it's essential, and it comes back to let's assess the risk in the organizations and the issues. And it may well be, you know what, 50% of my staff are factory hands, don't touch a computer. Therefore, I have no access to the network. Therefore, okay, the risk is negligible. But I've got two people that have the access to the core of everything, and it's a different conversation. So I'll shut up and
perfect.
hear what the others would think.
So look, first I'll ask a question and then I'll go to you, Cheryl, and then Sadid. So assuming so far everything we've said, and especially building upon what Brian and Ben just said, would this new world be a significant change to the way you're operating as a cybersecurity professional, or more generically, as we are operating as cybersecurity professionals? Cheryl, is this a whole new world for us, a big change?
It is a little bit. I think with cybersecurity at the work, we really focus on telling people, all your work details, your work email should be used for work purposes only. And this is partly the reason why we need to keep work emails, work credentials separate to your personal lives. I know many years ago, I was always on the computer and it was just easier to use my work email for anything, for newsletters, for shopping. It didn't really matter. And back, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, people weren't really educating others on the best practices to, look after your account details and stuff. These days, I think it's really important for organizations when they are educating and training their staff on being cyber safe at the workplace to really hone in on how they do it at home. So to give you an example, I know several people who have said to me they would forward their personal emails to their workplace. And why did they do that? Because they knew the workplace had tools to check on if, that was a suspicious email or not. But if you were to educate these people on why this email could be suspicious, they would have the knowledge and skills to be able to, I guess, feel confident to know if that email is risky or not. And so it's just really about giving that knowledge for people to go, I know how to do this at home. And once they start building up those life skills, they can then bring that into the workplace. But I think if you kind of target them at the home, then they'll be able to use that at home. They'll know how to kind of separate that from work and personal, and then also share that with their friends and families. So quite often I'll be saying to them, share what you're learning with your friends and families. If you've got a scam, share that as well, because everybody needs to learn.
Yeah, fantastic. You brought up some really great points. I'll get to you in a second, Sadid. We often talk at Culture of Cybersecurity about making things personal relevant, and therefore they become important. That's exactly what you just articulated, right? And you get a natural overflow into the organization from there. And people's cyber life skills, yeah, they're just not keeping up to date with what's going on and with the number one attack vector being phishing. You touched on that as well. So no, thank you. Absolutely fantastic, Cheryl. So Sadid, would all of this home and employees and parents and grandparents and new responsibilities, would that be a significant change for the way you, your organization, or we as professionals operate in the
I
cybersecurity
think
domain?
it's a change, but it's a change that's been long time coming. So it's if you know if any of the organization or if we say it as a community, it's sudden. I don't think that it's sudden. Yes, the COVID has excess or expedited or hastened it a bit more, but at the end of the day, from a responsibility perspective, I personally see it as a shared responsibility. So for an organization, as Ben quite rightly pointed out, it is about the cybersecurity risk. What is the enterprise risk? How we look at that risk, and then what is the organization then doing, or the steps that they're taking to manage the risk. The way I look at it is like, having a shared, like, if I look at it primarily more from a cyber defense sort of angle. So the perimeters have disappeared. People are working remotely, and sometimes the investment and the technological controls are not as strong for people that are working remotely or outside of the organizational perimeters. Then how do you really enforce your security if you don't have those appropriate controls in place, more from a tech layer perspective? So how do you make sure that your cybersecurity defense measures that we may have invested quite heavily in are working top notch within our boundaries, but are somewhat weak? That's where your shared defense model kicks in. That's where your talk about the responsibility being shared with your wider ecosystem, your staff members, their families, be, becomes more of a collective effort. So that's where organization, I think it's a relatively, from an investment perspective, it may not be that huge in comparison to what we would invest in from a technical layer perspective, but it would be like, to manage that risk, what are we doing to provide guidance and tools and policies to the individuals?
Right.
And how do we make sure that, we are promoting that personal cyber hygiene? At the end of the day, it comes down to your basic cyber hygiene. If you look at it, as we've been speaking about, majority of the threat would come via an email. So if you had basic cyber hygiene in place, and if staff members and their shared or loved ones were exercising the basic level of cyber hygiene, then the likelihood of those cyber risks being realized would significantly come down. And I think that's where, with a little bit of effort, I think our management of the risk can significantly evolve.
No, fantastic. Look, devil's advocate question. Ben, all this is wonderful, but isn't it an invasion of privacy?
Yeah, interesting question. So, one would argue it's the opposite, I, in the sense that if you, again, I think Sadid and Cheryl and Brian have all talked about, there's different risk levels for different sorts of organizations. If like the 50% of the workforce working on an assembly line, I think was a Brian example. If that were the case, then you don't need it's not a one size fits all. If you're talking about issues of national defense, or that if you were going through, I don't want to pick on any one nation in particular, but if you knew you were going through the Beijing airport and there was a good chance that the CEO would get stopped by border control and have their things searched, and then they might have copied their hard drive in that environment. Well, then you have to expect that that they might be doing it remotely as well. And so yeah, sorry, it really comes down to how high is the risk level that you're trying to guard against. And I think if you were minded that, all right, well, we should have um, an upgraded or we should have password protection. We shouldn't just use the default password on our router and modem at work. If that's the decision you've reached for the work environment, then for goodness sake, do the same. Make sure the same thing's happening at home if there's work access to work data at home. Um, Similarly, if it is an organization where there's a risk that, well, I had a case myself many years ago, again, slightly out of the context of cyber specifically, but where a union was negotiating with a large employer that was my client, and the CEO of the large employer had some union reps come in and like made sure that there wasn't anybody else in the room at the time, just two union reps and the CEO, and they pushed across the desk a photo of his 7-year-old daughter walking to school that morning with a superimposed target on it and saying, accidents can happen. And that was a negotiating tactic over an enterprise bargaining agreement. Just bloody disgusting, obviously. If you're in a situation where people that you're either negotiating with or that are your competitors or that given the amounts of money involved or the security issues at stake because of energy supply or other important issues, if these things are present within that work environment, then just for goodness sake, extend it into the work environment that it exists also at home. And then you asked specifically about privacy. Well, is that CEO that I was describing, whose 7-year-old daughter's photo was pushed across the table by the union reps that during that negotiation, he wasn't concerned about privacy. He was concerned about the safety of his daughter. If you, as an employer and a board, are protecting your workers, and the stakes are high enough, you should be protecting their loved ones as well. Otherwise, that's a vulnerability vector. And I had, sorry, at the risk of just going on and on and on, was working on some restraint related cases where employees had left and they had access to a lot of important stuff on their phone, and then they could use that pricing information or that sensitive client data to go and give their competitor an advantage. That employer needed a bring your own device policy that defined, all right, well, in what circumstances can you be using your personal devices for work-related content, and when shouldn't you? And that was to protect against the risk of data theft in a competitive environment. But these cyber risks are, an equivalent risk.
No, absolutely. Brian, look, back to you for a second. You earlier mentioned this convergence between the physical world and the online world, and I've heard you talk many times about there is no such thing as privacy. So on the back of this conversation about privacy, are any of the things we're talking about now invasions of privacy? And
Yeah, it's hard. I think the world needs to have a very big debate of what privacy is anymore. Obviously, Ben was looking from privacy from a personal perspective and the legal perspective. And sometimes, forgive me, Ben, but the legal system sits outside the reality of the world is now functioning, because seriously, it can take many years to get a piece of legislation through to enact. So that's not a criticism, it's just an observation. And the speed of which digital environments work means that we're going to be confronted with issues that the legal system has not yet addressed, or nor sometimes even prepared for. Agenti or AI, for example, in a conversation yesterday, some of the things that are happening there, we are not thinking about. Computer engineers and scientists are, but no one else. But I think privacy has been a mandate by which a lot of action is taken, and to an extent, our politicians and legislators understand privacy in the old world context. But I would welcome debate of what privacy means in today. Like, for example, we've had the Qantas data breach, 6.7 million, was it, or 5.7 million, and I was one of them, lost all this data, and that's a breach of privacy. Well, was my data already out there in existence in the dark web because of previous data breaches at, Medibank and Optus and Latitude? And the answer is yes, some of that was already there. So can you have your privacy breached if no new information that's already in existence is now just added to it, reinforcing it? So that's I'm sure Ben would have an opinion on that. But I think in this converged world, and going back to what Sadid said, I think it is a shared responsibility. The problem that I see is that the challenge is not being communicated to mainstream entities, as in the staff and employees, the people, parents, community members, because a lot of people think that technology will solve everything. And a lot of people think it's on the security team's shoulders, this burden of security. I don't have to play a role because they're going to do it, because they've got the technology, they've got the budgets, they get all this, they talk in languages I don't even understand. And so I think, and I'm very long-winded on this response, but there are so many issues constantly moving. I used the term chaos before, which we are. And listening to what Cheryl said before, I made a note, and it really hit me. She talked about people using their work emails for private purposes when subscribing. Now, I remember it was a recent cultural diagnostic we did, James. I think I saw 70% of those people interviewed indicated they do use their work email for private purposes.
80%.
80%, there you go. Now that's massive. And no wonder we're having this converged world exists. And it comes back to the point, and I'm not talking out of school, but it questions, what is the induction program of the expectation acceptable use policies look like for new hires when they come into an organization? And I know from one example, we can't get 5 minutes in there. Or if they wanted to give us some time from a cybersecurity education perspective, it couldn't be more than 5 minutes. And therefore, are we setting the seeds for our own future failures because we're missing that key point when you define to a new employee what are the expectations, what are the rules, the accountability structures around this? We've glossed over it. Oh, there's too much other stuff we've got to get in there, like workplace health and safety. Well, if you listen to Ben, we're there now, and we've actually got to change our thinking. So I'll shut up.
No, fantastic. Thank you. That's what we're here. We please, Sadid and Cheryl and Ben and Brian, don't be shy. That's why we need you here to say what's on your mind. Look, I want to go back a couple of steps from something Sadid said. I wrote a note that I found really, really fascinating. Hopefully some of the rest of you do as well. And he was alluding to the fact that this change was not sudden. He suggested that it was a change over time. And that got me thinking about related natural changes over time. One of the things we're seeing, for example, is a convergence with HR and cybersecurity, because a lot of education and training is in learning and development, or within HR and people and culture, whatever it's called in your organization. A natural link in many places with occupational health and safety, as many of Ben's examples, and again, we see in cultural cybersecurity all the time. Let me just open it up to whichever one of you want to respond first, Sadid or Cheryl, whoever feels moved. Are you seeing this? Is this a natural convergence, a natural linking that we will see cybersecurity, do you think, talking to HR and people in culture and learning and development more and more? Or should we? The link to occupational health and safety, anything come to mind, Cheryl, Sadid?
I think it's just changing how we're recognizing this particular change. So as you already alluded to and I mentioned before, so the change was already well underway. It's about formal recognition and how we are responding to it in a structured manner. I don't think that there is a right answer yet. Obviously, we have seen the convergence. For example, like if we go 7 or 8 or 10 years ago, we wouldn't call cyber as in cybersecurity. It was more information security. That's where it initiated from. It's turned into cybersecurity. We are now seeing the convergence of cybersecurity risk with physical security risk. We're talking about convergence of cyber and physical security. We're talking more from an architectural perspective. What does it mean for Internet of Things? What does it mean to organization? And it's just the organization, how fast the organization evolves to cope with this change and respond to it in a structured manner that will basically dictate what success would look like, how effectively we are managing that risk. At the end of the day, it's the risk for that particular organization.
Right.
So I think I already mentioned that the pandemic basically accelerated the shift or the convergence as we are calling it now. And from an organizational perspective and from a cybersecurity expertise perspective, we are just catching up strategically and operationally. Like, hey, what does our strategy look like? What does our operations look like? How do we need to evolve? How do we tackle it? I think organizations are basically in a catch-up mode.
Oh, fantastic. And I love, you mentioned a couple of times that there is no one size fits all. I just love that. And several of other people have talked about that. That's fantastic. Cheryl, look, structurally, have you seen, and if you haven't, what would you like to see in terms of structural changes related to HR, OH&S, and cyber?
I agree. It's been slowly moving in this direction. It hasn't been just an immediate thing. I feel that what has accelerated it has been, the few breaches that have happened over the last couple of years. Like if you think about 5, 6 years ago, nobody would have been talking about cybersecurity, but now these big breaches are happening. There's penalties that are coming in place. So organizations are now starting to think, oh, this could actually happen to me. So now they're actually starting to think, the boards are starting to think a bit more on, the risks that are happening in their organizations and how they're actually going to be mitigating some of those risks. So I think you will start seeing a bigger change over time, understanding how they can make those changes. And I think we're already starting to see it. So even in, I guess, security teams are starting to grow. You'll quite often see that, if there has been a restructure, quite often security don't really get cut because if an organization was to be breached and they did cut their security, like that's going to probably be all over the news, right? And then that also like, in even the roles that I play, cyber security uplift culture, I'm starting to see more organizations bring these roles into place because they know the importance of that human element, that human risk within that organization. Yeah, I just see that it is growing. We're starting to work more closely with HR and occupation health and safety. I was actually talking to our occupation health and safety team recently, and like having a look at what they're trying to do and what I'm trying to do is very, very similar. Like if you put them side by side, they're pretty much the same, except
Right?
one is physical, one's digital.
Exactly.
And I said to them, we should be working closer together on how we can push these messages out.
Fantastic. So, very quick question to each of you. Currently, every place I've ever seen a cyber team or an awareness team or a security team, they're reporting within a line that gets them up to IT. Would you like to see it move to a direct report, thinking totally structurally right now? Would you like to see that change? Would you rather be reporting to HR or OH&S, Cheryl? Or are you still happy in the IT realm, of a reporting structure?
I think in IT kind of makes sense. Security touches on every part of the business of an organization. So I feel security should be reporting basically to the top, really, and
Gotcha.
having that voice to the top. But for now, I think it's okay to be insecure into IT. So long as organization knows we're touching every single part of the organization. It's
Good.
not just the IT part, and it's just not IT responsibility. It's what everybody's been saying. It's a shared responsibility.
Good. Sadid, you happy in the IT
I think I would challenge the word IT.
Okay,
The
good, perfect.
IT has evolved, so it's called, for example, even in my last workplace, and even here, it's digital. So what does digital mean? Is it same like some people would say, hey, it's just a name, tomato, like IT or digital, but it is in essence really evolving, and it's about. For example, cybersecurity, if it was to sit outside of the digital or technology realm, then how would you, from a people, process, and technology perspective, it would become extremely challenging. So I don't think we're there yet. So that input through IT or through digital, it is quite important. But at the same time, what is more important is making sure that you have that influence or voice at the board suitably, and again goes back to the organizational dynamics, how it's structured and how it flows. As long as whoever leads cyber has that functional responsibility back to the board through appropriate mechanism, I think that's what's more important, regardless from a structural perspective where it would sit. Having said that, I would say if cyber was to sit anywhere else outside of digital, it would I would see some significant challenges as to how that would play out.
Gotcha. Good. No problem at all. I love that idea. Have a whole new director of digital services up above digital marketing, digital cyber, digital technology. Yeah, it's a fascinating. Brian, any insights?
Yeah, look, going back to the theme of convergence, I've always, for those that are people I've bought over the years, I've always talked about digital playing a lateral movement role and starts to, sometimes we talk about cultural shift by digital osmosis. And I think through osmosis, digital, because of the functionality of way most parts of the business and organization operate this way, all those touch points are already there. So they're being influenced. If you look at the largest companies in the world, they're all digital. And I think we get this mindset in the pre-converged world that we can containerize everything and put in nice little structures, but there is an underpinning influence of now digital dependency that cannot be ignored, which means it's converging, controlling, because it's now dependent. Your greatest risk is losing digital capability for the vast majority of organizations. And it's how we, and what's possibly limiting, this could be controversial, what is limiting a lot of organizations is that their board and their executive don't understand the digital environment appropriately enough to take advantage and then progressively move forward in the way they ordinarily would if it was something they experienced 30 years ago.
Absolutely. Perfect segue. Thank you, Brian, into my next question. So, all of you at some point, hypothetically, I'm suggesting you've got to deal with someone who comes up to you and says, why are we wasting money and time and energy and effort, all of which are scarce resources in our organizations, on training people at home? Why am I training these people's children? Why am I involving their parents and their grandparents? For heaven's sake, what are we doing?
Tell them to pull their head out of their clacker and get with the real program.
Yeah, well, I mean, if I just look at it from the privacy breach perspective, like, so back when GDPR came in 2018, and then the Australian government followed suit by upgrading the Privacy Act penalties prior to that time, it was a bit of a slap on the wrist, a privacy breach. But it's been a while now since, I don't know, 2019, 2020, I think it was roughly. Maximum penalties for privacy breaches are as high as $50 million per breach, or 3 times the value of the benefit obtained from the conduct, or 30% of the body corporate's adjusted turnover during the breach period. So,
Get your
that's not
attention.
important to the person that's concerned about money, then I don't know what would be.
Fantastic. All right, changing gears. Do we have any social or community responsibility as employees, as organizations, to help increase all of Australians' cybersecurity skills? Jump in.
Yeah, I mean,
Sure.
despite I'm not a big fan of saying that business owners are, responsible for everything because as a business owner myself I feel like there's enough of that already. I don't want to join the mob in saying, oh no, well, the consumers, the people out in the street, they should just be treated wrapped in cotton wool and protected and put in a bubble, and the big government or big business should look after them. Yeah, I'm not a fan of that.
So if I could just take that on you, you cheap bugger, failing to invest in your people, Ben, I'm horribly shocked.
Well,
I'm
no,
just
the
joking,
question
of
was about
course.
community. Like,
It
what
was, it was.
responsibility?
So where I see it, I'm going to say yes, but it comes through a different way. And what I would suggest is that by educating our people appropriately to the right level so they can live their 24/7 lives, we then educate the community. So again, I'll use that term by osmosis. We are uplifting skills, the cyber life skills of our people. Therefore, we are positively affecting their communities. So I don't think business should have the responsibility in a black and white scenario of you must go and educate your community. And we'd always often hear the big end of town saying, oh, we're good corporate citizens. But if we apply good investment into our people, by relationships and by the environment, it will naturally uplift community. So I think we can tick both boxes without additional effort other than just focusing in on our people.
Cheryl, Sadid?
Yeah, I think it's goes back to that balanced approach. So whilst technically or legally speaking, I'll probably agree with Ben. To what extent do you go to fulfill your responsibility, and where does your responsibility actually end? So obviously, from my perspective, the organization got to take the responsibility that your ecosystem, your community, i.e. your staff, are fully aware of their responsibility. So at the end of the day, security is not only security teams or IT teams or even HR or physical security teams responsibility, but it is everybody's responsibility. But then to keep your ecosystem safe, how do you how do you contribute back to the community? I think that's where your wider enterprise wide collective corporate or government led initiatives, for example, I can speak of that example from my previous workplace where I came across that cybersecurity apprentices where high school graduates being introduced directly into the workforces and appropriate mechanisms being put in. So that conversation and that involvement, whilst a small example, is really driving that conversation. Hey, cyber is important, and it's not just another risk. And when you have those sort of systematic approach to getting that conversation going in communities and ecosystem, that contributes to your overall uplift in awareness. So I think it's a collective approach, and how do we each organization contribute to that collective approach? I think that it comes down to that whole entire well-knitted system.
Good. Cheryl, any thoughts?
I think first organization should educate their staff. I know some organizations don't even do that just yet. And if you think about it, probably half of the workforce are still people from Gen X or baby boomers, and they didn't grow up with technology. They didn't grow up in this digital platform. And so at the time, there was no education for these people, and they're just going along with it and doing what they think best. So I think we first need to educate our staff, which some organizations aren't doing. And then it's a social benefit, I guess, just an organization benefit. I do get people coming up to me in my workplace, going, I didn't know about this. I didn't know about that. Thank you very much. How do I learn more about this? So educating them in their personal lives, I think is really important, which will bring um, what's the word? They'll be more positive about coming to work and using those skills in the workplace. And then they'll be also able to share that out with their community, their family, their friends. They've learned something, they can share that. And I think that's really important as well. But no, I think organizations don't necessarily have to focus on the family, the extended family, and whatnot. But I think, just by educating the people in their organizations about the benefits for them in their personal lives will naturally extend that.
Right. It just naturally
Can I
flows
can
over.
I just ask Ben a
Yeah.
question? Ben, you touched on the privacy, and we saw it go from about 2.2 million to 50 million, got a lot of attention. And we saw a bit more buzz happening around the Australian environments, talking to clients and that sort of thing. GDPR initiated a lot of improvements to programs when that came into play. We know that when workplace health and safety really got its stuff together, and the legislation come out making the board accountable, and supervisors, line managers, executives of organizations for workplace injuries, that got a lot of traction. Could everything be accelerated by simply a piece of legislation to tweak the existing workplace health and safety? And forgive me if I'm not getting into the latest vernacular, I always stuff it up. If that legislation, do you think, was tweaked with a clear, defined clause that said digital safety is now part of workplace health and safety, and that would actually generate more support for such education programs?
Yeah, look, short answer, yes. I mean, one of the things that happened in Queensland relatively recently, within the last 18 months or so, was that under the existing workplace health and safety legislation, the Queensland government brought out a code specifically for what they were calling psychosocial hazards. And so this was basically the responsibility that in one form or another has been around for a long time to prevent bullying, to prevent sexual harassment, to prevent various other forms of the risks that cause risks to people's mental health. And it sort of collectivized it under one psychosocial hazard code. Um, and I think that when we were talking before about that, and God, it seems to be the word of the podcast, the convergence of, should it be a reporting line under cyber security or information technology or digital, as Sadid said, or should it be an HR issue? It's a false. You can't have one without the other. I mean, I'm not the cyber expert, you guys are, but my understanding is that most incidents occur because of a human failing to do something rather than a technical deficiency. Um, and so to do one without the other just doesn't make any sense. The Yeah, I would also just agree everything that Cheryl most recently said. Whilst I'm not in favour of companies being responsible for educating the community at large, their own workforce is essential. There's been a concept at law for hundreds of years called vicarious liability. It basically means that whatever your employees do, you're, as the employer, responsible for it. If your employee drives a car negligently and injures or kills somebody, that's an employer problem. The same if an employed financial advisor gives bad financial advice, it's the employer's problem. Um, by not training people in how to protect themselves and others, whether it's at work or whether it's at home or whether it's on the train, like Cheryl said, in between, um, you are, as an employer and as a board of a company, you are creating false gaps in where your responsibility lies. Your responsibility lies wherever your people are and wherever the access to your data is. Um, Sorry, did I answer your question? What was the question?
Yes, you did. You simply answered it with the word yes at the very beginning, as far as I was concerned.
No, that was a great
Yeah,
summary. So thank you.
thank you. All right, look, we've got 9.5, 10 odd minutes to go, so I'd like to move towards the closing question, because we have to address what are some suggestions that you all have of ways to help us keep our personal and work lives separate where we can, and safe when we can, because what everybody wants are the takeaways. What do we need to do in order to stay safe, in order to stay safe, given everything we've talked about for the last 50 minutes. Sadid, would you mind starting, and then we'll go to Cheryl and then Ben and end up with Brian?
Yeah, do what what I have not been doing, and that is I haven't successfully kept my work and personal devices separate. So I think that that's one thing I would highly encourage everyone to completely have dedicated work devices and isolate work and personal networks where possible. So sometimes that does become blurred, and uh, becomes very challenging with the sheer amount of busyness and relentless activities that are happening in this transformation, which is not only digital. I think it's just how the corporation these days are. So it is quite important just for your psychosocial safety and your peace of mind to make sure that you're drawing your line somewhere as the boundaries between work and home are being blurred. It is, that's where, and we are, it's becoming quite challenging as to where do you draw the line between your personal and work lives as well. So it is quite important that we are drawing those lines really clearly, because the culture of these habits will improve the overall cyber hygiene and overall work hygiene that contributes to the overall maturity anyways.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sadid. Cheryl, suggestion?
I mean, I agree, trying to keep your work and personal lives separate, having different devices. Quite often, you can download the work emails onto your personal phone to make it easier. Everything just seems easier. But if we can keep them separate, then it also, helps with that right to disconnect. We've got that in place. If you have all your work emails, apps on your personal phone or personal devices, it's so easy to just jump onto that. You'll see a pop up, you just go onto that. So it even just helps to, disconnect. And to disconnect also could be turning off those notifications. I think in your phones you can turn off notifications after a certain time, which will just help to reduce that anxiety to keep working with your work information any time of the day. But yeah, definitely separating, not using your work emails for personal information such as newsletters and shopping and stuff.
Yes, you reminded us of the employee's right to not be contacted. Very important to remember. Ben, I know we know cyber's not your main concern, but would you have any suggestions, or how do you personally try and keep your personal and work lives separate?
No, I'm like Sadid. I'm not pretty. I'm terrible at separating them. But I suppose just to supplement my answer to Brian's earlier question, I think it wouldn't require a major change to the top level of legislation to implement some cyber-specific
Yeah.
directive. You could do it through a subordinate piece of legislation, or I think last session 2 of this series, I put a link or provided access to a government issued safe work at home checklist. And it could be as simple as just adding cyber protection to that safe work at home checklist. But to go back to, I suppose, a story as I said before, I've had cases where employees have resigned and taken a whole bunch of important corporate data with them because they had it all stored on their personal devices. So, again, that just so demonstrates the wisdom of the points that I think Cheryl and Sadid have already made, that trying to keep these devices separate is a good idea. And on the flip side, I don't think this happens very often, but there was one employer client that to try to protect and preserve what was being captured on personal devices where they were being used for a work purpose, they had some software on any personal devices that were being used for work purposes that was taking a complete scrape, scan, or yeah, saving and doing backups on what was being saved off those personal devices, and then those backups were being kept in a work environment, and they discovered after an employee had left that it turns out they had stored a whole bunch of photographs that he had taken of his own children in the bath, his naked children, basically. And so they had an ex-employee's naked children in their work databases. And, obviously
What a
there's all sorts
mess.
of implications associated with
Right.
that. Uh, yes, so that if that doesn't demonstrate the wisdom of trying to keep these things separate, then I don't know what does.
Perfect. Perfect example. Great. What a conundrum. Brian, thank you.
Yeah, what's really interesting is it's how we've evolved and along this journey over the last 15, 20 years, but longer for some. But what's really interesting is that, it wasn't that long ago, or corporations, and this was well before COVID. I remember going to a presentation where this was being espoused as a tactic moving forward. And they talked about sociability. They talk about people more willing to use digital devices if they're using their own. It was all about introducing the concept of BYOD. So, and of course, I'm sitting there as a cynical copper, or still a copper then, thinking, BS, this isn't about familiarity with the device. This is just the organization saving money, because they didn't have to go and buy computers. They didn't have to go and buy laptops and mobile and phones and stuff. So it was actually the organization that thrust upon many people the concept of bring your own device. And now we're saying, well, how are we going to keep it separate? But these are the conundrums and the challenges we accept in chaos, convergence, and evolution. So no problem with that. But I think sometimes the challenges we have now we want to separate, but that's okay. But a couple of things that have come out for me today is I want to encourage everyone to think about, what does your induction program look like? So when people come into your environment, how are you setting the expectations of the behaviors that you want them to exemplify to keep your organization, your data, your people safe? And obviously now extends to wherever they work or whoever they work with. And I would look at how are you building their cyber life skills to transition to a healthier environment 24/7, no matter where they are.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, so look, wrapping up. One of the things I've said recently to a couple of different groups is it's not 1970 anymore. And what do I mean by that? Look, in 1970, I was a young teenager living in Brooklyn, New York. I used to get alone on the subway and take the subway all alone. I was never bothered into downtown Lower Manhattan, get off in Soho and Greenwich Village and go around and listen to music and coffee shops and walk around. I'm sorry, everybody who's listening, but that's not the world anymore. If someone calls you and tells you they're from Telstra, or more recently, if they call you and tell you, hi, we're from Qantas and we want to check because you've heard the breach recently, hang up. All right. This is not 1970 anymore. The world has changed. So hopefully you've listened to 1, 2, or 3 of these webinars. You start to see that it's our responsibility. The technology is doing its job, but in the most recent Office of the Australian Information Commissioner report, only 2% of breaches in the previous 6 months that they reported on were due to technical or systems failures. That means 98% of them were you and me and our colleagues and our parents and our children being defeated at our keyboards. So that's why we're here talking. Thank you so much, Sadid. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Cheryl. As always, Brian. Thank you, Ryan, in the background. Thanks for making all this happen. Thank you, audience. Be well, stay safe, and we'll see you next time.